What's going on, YouTube fam? I'm Jordz the Carpenter. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how you can make this Chevron cutting board with juice groove in a few simple steps. So stay tuned to find out more. For today's project I used Purple Heart, Walnut, and some maple. Before I make my cuts, I always double check and make sure that the saw is set to 90 degrees. Then I start by cutting my maple into 1/4 inch strips. I actually messed this up. I was meant to cut it to 1.5 inch strips, which is the thickness of my cutting board, then down to 1/4 inch strips. I ended up making these cuts off camera. Now I want to cut my walnut, so I'm going to set my saw to 1.5 inches and start making those rips. I'm going to start ripping the Purple Heart into 1.5 inch strips, which is the thickness of my cutting board. As I started to make these cuts with my table saw, I ran into a small issue. I blew the breaker. Hey! Okay, let's try this again. Once I got the power back up and running, I finished making the rips at 1.5 inches. Because the wood is so hard, I took it a bit slower this time, making sure not to blow the breaker. Again. Now that the Purple Heart is cut to the thickness of my cutting board, I can start cutting the 1/2 inch strips, which is the final size I'm going for. And my saw is still struggling, but I made it work with only a little bit of smoke. Now everything is cut and laid out the way I want it, so it's time to get ready for the glue up. Here I'm using some painter's tape to save my clamps from any glue squeeze out that drips from the underside. Won't gum up my clamps, and it just makes my life a lot easier the next time I want to use them. Now my clamps are standing by and ready to go, so I'm going to spread some Gorilla Glue on one side of each of my strips, making sure to use a healthy amount spread evenly across the entire surface. It's not necessary to glue both sides as long as you make sure you have lots on one side, so when they come together there's plenty to go around. I'm using my square as a straight edge to line up the ends on an angle. Because I have minimal material, I want to get as much out of this piece as possible without having too much waste when I make my final rips in the next step. I take the glue up and drop it on a couple clamps. Then I grab a wet rag and start wiping off the glue that's squeezed out, so I have a nice look at all the strips, ensuring they stay flush with each other, keeping it nice and flat. Then I start applying light pressure to the clamps and wiping off any excess glue as I go. This step makes less work for me when I pull the piece out of the clamps, because it's much easier to get rid of the glue when it's still wet than doing so when it's rock hard. Now that the glue is dry, I can start removing the clamps and prepping the board for the planer. First, I take my scraper tool I picked up from Home Depot to get rid of any leftover dried glue. This didn't quite go as fast as I'd like, so I busted out my orbital sander with some 40 grit sandpaper and just knocked down the rest of the dried glue. And as you can see, I didn't do the best job keeping the strips flush, so I had a bit of wobble. Not to worry though, this is an easy fix. I grab my planer sled and start putting little wedges under any high spots to prevent the wobble as it moves through my planer. If you're interested on how I made this planer sled, let me know in the comments and I can make a video on how it's made. Taking off a little bit at a time, I send the board through, getting everything flush. Then guess what happened? I blew the breaker again. I forgot I had my heater running, and it tends to trip the breaker when I have multiple tools running off the same breaker. Now that one side is perfectly flat, I pop it off the sled and knock off any hot glue left stuck to the bottom. Then I send it back through to make both sides parallel with each other. Once I finish that, I'm ready to cut off the uneven edge so I can rip it into even strips for the next glue up. Because the edges of the board are not even, I'm going to use this simple and effective joiner jig, which is just a piece of MDF that will run along the fence so I get a nice straight and square cut. You can use any kind of plywood for this as long as it has a straight edge, and I'm just taping it down with a couple strips of two-sided tape. I set my fence to the desired width to make the final cuts, then chop it into 4 even pieces. I wanted a 9-inch wide cutting board, so I ripped my strips to 2 1/4 inches. Once I was done that, I quickly flip and lay them out on the table saw to visualize my final design. Just as I did before, I tape my clamps to protect them from glue squeeze out, and then flip the pieces onto their edge, lay down a healthy amount of Gorilla Glue, then flip them back and push them together, creating my chevron pattern. I then start applying light pressure to my clamps, making sure as they get tight that all my points come together nicely, making the perfect chevron. This part is crucial because if anything comes out of line once the glue sets, you either live with it or start over. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I didn't get it perfect, but I got it pretty damn close, and that's good enough for me. No one's perfect, right? This may look like a lot of clamps, but I assure you that there is no such thing as too many clamps. No one wants gaps, and I didn't want to take any chances. Now that the glue is dry, it's time to get it out of the clamps and cut to final size. Woo! Alright, over to the chop saw we go. I cut the ends of the board to the final size I want before sending it back through the planer to clean up any dry glue and or unevenness. This step isn't completely necessary, as you could just use your orbital and get everything flush, but since I have this awesome tool in my shop, I figured I would send it through for a couple light passes on each side to save me some time sanding. She's really starting to look like something now. But every nice cutting board needs a juice groove for those juicy steaks you'll be cutting with this bad boy. So I made this simple jig that you can make too with some scrap 2x4 laying around. I won't go into too much detail on this part, but if you'd like a more detailed video on the jig, let me know in the comments. I made this groove in 2 light passes with a 1/2-inch cove bit on my DeWalt cordless router. Now that the juice groove is cut, I set my table saw to 30 degrees and cut a quick bevel on the underside of the board. This gives it a nice shape, and it also doubles as a good spot to get your fingers underneath to pick it up off the counter. I make the first 2 cuts along the length of the cutting board, then I reset my saw and make the other 2 cuts along the width. When making the last 2 cuts, I don't want to take off too much, so I made a few passes to make sure that my corners lined up perfectly. You can always take off more, but you can't add it back. Here's a little pro tip for you. Use a pencil to lightly mark the surface so you know where you've sanded and where you may have missed. Once all marks are gone, you can move on up to the next grit. I start with 100 grit sandpaper and then move on to 120, then 150, 180, 220, and finish with 320. To get into the juice groove, I use the 1/2-inch spindle paper off my spindle sander to sand the groove smooth, removing any machine marks left from the router. I find this works really well since it's basically the perfect fit to the groove. The light you see me using helps to show any imperfections like nicks or scratches or even gaps that may have been overlooked while sanding. I noticed there was a small gap in my glue up when sanding the bottom, so this trick is great for filling any gaps that you may have in your joints. I just cleaned out the hole with my knife to clear any dried glue. Then you're going to take some glue and mix it with the dust from sanding into a thick paste, then push it into the gap and sand it off. Once filled and sanded, it is almost unnoticeable, as you can see in this clip. I take a 1/16 inch roundover bit, just to soften the edges while maintaining a fairly sharp and square look. If you leave the edge sharp with no round over, it could give you or your client a paper-like cut, and trust me, I say this from experience. This board is meant to be cut on, not to cut you. Before I make the final pass with my 320 grit sandpaper, I grab a spray bottle and soak the wood in water, then wipe away any excess liquid, let it dry, then hit it with the final grit. This is called water popping, which allows the wood to swell and raises the grain, creating a very rough, uneven surface. If you skip this step, chances are when adding your finish, it will make the wood swell and give you an uneven, rough surface, which isn't ideal because I can guarantee you, when finished, the first thing you or your client will do is rub their hand across the surface, expecting a baby bottom smooth finish, and it will feel rough and unfinished, leaving you or them unsatisfied with the work. And last but not least, before I add the finish, I gotta add the Jordz the Carpenter logo to this thing. And we made it! The final and my favorite step is adding the finish. I'm using Walrus oil to take this board from 0 to 100 real quick. Using a healthy amount of oil, I coat the bottom and spread it out evenly. Then I will let it soak for at least 15 minutes, allowing the oil to penetrate deep into the grain. Once it's been soaking, I give it another quick spread, then flip the piece and repeat the same process. Only this time, I will leave the excess oil on top and bottom and let it soak for 24 hours before buffing off the excess oil. And there you have it. That's how I made this Chevron cutting board. If you liked this video and learned something today, I would appreciate it if you like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.